You know, there's a certain comfort we all look for when we turn on the news, especially when you see a massive global crisis unfolding right in front of you.
Oh, absolutely. It's a psychological need, really.
Right. We want to believe that behind all the podiums and the loud press conferences, there is a quiet room somewhere. And in that quiet room, there are incredibly serious, highly educated people playing this methodical, multi-generational game of geopolitical chess.
Yes, the illusion of control. It's fundamental.
Exactly. We expect that someone has read the instruction manual before they reach for the big red button.
It is a very necessary safety net for all of us. The idea that even if things are incredibly tense, the international order is being managed by a steady hand. Because frankly, without that illusion of control, global markets would just free fall and our own peace of mind would be completely gone.
But then you wake up and you step into the reality of the world right now. And let's just ground ourselves for a second, because today is Tuesday, March 17, 2026.
It's been a very rough morning.
Yeah, to say the least. I mean, if you, the listener, have looked at your retirement portfolio this morning, or if you tried to fill up your car with gas recently, you already know the truth. The chessboard hasn't just been flipped over.
No, it hasn't.
The board has literally been set on fire. The pieces have melted into these little plastic puddles, and the players are somewhere in the back room just throwing darts completely blindfolded. The expectation of serious statesmanship just feels... it feels completely gone.
It is the absolute definition of diplomatic muddy waters right now. We are watching traditional deterrence mechanisms fail in real time. And the resulting chaos is spilling directly into our domestic economies. It's not abstract anymore.
And that is exactly why I'm so intrigued to welcome you to today's deep dive. Because amidst all this deafening noise, we actually have a map today. We are focusing entirely on a single, highly detailed, and honestly deeply cynical piece of geopolitical analysis.
It's a fascinating read.
It really is. It's a paper titled Kayaks, Petitos y Geopolitica Global, which translates to Kayaks, Rubber Ducks, and Global Geopolitics.
Yeah.
And it's written by Alejandro Cariatti Martelloni.
Yeah, and the title alone tells you this is not going to be your standard dry academic white paper from some stuffy Washington think tank.
How it throws the traditional academic jargon completely out the window. The core premise we are exploring today, and it is a brilliant but terrifying lens to look through, is that the current global order isn't a chess match at all. Instead, it is operating exactly like a dark stand-up comedy routine.
Which is such a wild concept, but it fits so perfectly.
Right. Imagine a routine written by a committee of Hollywood scriptwriters who are on the absolute verge of a nervous breakdown. Yeah. That is the world in 2026.
It is a remarkably accurate way to frame the events of early 2026. Because academics like to use this term, they call it hegemonic transition.
Which sounds very polite.
Extremely polite. It's a sanitized way of saying the reigning global superpower is severely overextended, losing its grip and just flailing wildly. But by viewing this through the lens of a stand-up routine, we can see how global superpowers are quite literally improvising their way through simultaneous crises.
Just making it up as they go along.
Exactly. They are writing the punchlines as they go, desperately hoping the audience, which is the rest of the world, doesn't just boo them off the stage.
And the cost of the 2-drink minimum at this particular comedy club is your grocery bill. But before we get into the heavy mechanics of this, I want to clearly set the mission for our deep dive today. Our goal is to connect the dots between 3 global theaters that on the surface seem completely disconnected.
And they span the entire globe.
Right. We're going to look at a literal fiery war currently raging in the Middle East. Then we are going to pivot down to South America to examine this bizarre reality TV style political romance playing out in Argentina. And finally, we will look at the Caribbean, where a sovereign nation is experiencing a complete apocalyptic blackout.
The analytical through line here is crucial to understand. The goal is to demonstrate how these aren't isolated regional incidents. They are actually all punchlines in the exact same overarching joke.
The joke about the overextended empire.
Yes. An empire trying to spin a dozen plates at once while the structural foundation beneath it is completely cracking.
And now, before we dive into the deep end of this material, I need to make one thing very, very clear to you, the listener. The source material we are unpacking today covers incredibly raw, highly charged, and frankly deadly political actions.
Very polarized events.
Exactly. We are talking about massive military operations. We are talking about deeply polarizing politicians from both the far left and the far right, and events that are literally unfolding as we speak today. So I want to firmly state that in this deep dive, we are maintaining strict, absolute neutrality.
We have to.
Right. We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the political viewpoints, the wars, or the specific politicians mentioned in this paper. Our only job today is to impartially unpack the fascinating arguments, the logistical data, and the sheer audacity of the narrative presented in the text. We are basically just the mechanics putting the car up on the lift to show you how the engine works.
Precisely. We are analyzing the architecture of the joke. We aren't here to tell you whether you should laugh or cry or, vote a certain way.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with the first joke in our geopolitical stand-up routine. And this one is incredibly dark. It's categorized by the author as Operation Epic Fury, the $115 punchline.
A very expensive punchline.
To say the least. Let's set the stage for the listener. It's the early hours of February 28, 2026. The United States and Israel initiate a massive joint military campaign against Iran.
And the nomenclature alone really sets the tone here. The U.S. portion of the campaign is given this incredibly cinematic, aggressive name. They called it Operation Epic Fury.
Like a blockbuster movie title.
Exactly. And the Israeli counterpart is called Roaring Lion. And the way this was positioned to the global public was a classic, highly polished political setup. The narrative pushed by Washington and Tel Aviv was that this would be a clean, quick surgical intervention.
They really emphasized surgical right.
Yes. The stated objective was to permanently eliminate Iran's nuclear infrastructure and heavily degrade its ballistic missile capabilities in one swift blow.
But the catalog of destruction detailed in the paper is just staggering. It reads less like a targeted strike and more like a year-end sales brochure for the defense industry. I mean, we are talking about B-2 stealth bombers, massive fleets of B-1 Lancers, and B-52 Stratofortresses.
Both converging at once.
Right. And they weren't just flying out of the Middle East, they were literally launching from bases in the UK.
Yes, primarily operating out of RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire. And to understand the scale of this, you really have to look at the logistics of global strike capabilities.
Because it's not like flying a commercial jet.
Not at all. You don't just casually fly a B-2 Spirit bomber from the UK to Iran and back. These are aircraft that require highly specialized climate-controlled hangars because their radar-absorbent skin is incredibly sensitive to the weather.
Wow, I didn't even know that. So they need special garages, basically.
Exactly. And the coordination requires massive mid-air refueling armadas spanning across European and Middle Eastern airspace. They need electronic warfare escorts to blind regional radars. We are talking about thousands of support personnel just to get the planes over the target.
And the initial PR spin from Washington was instantly dialed up to 11. After the first 10 days where they hit over 5,000 military targets, you had figures like Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Vice President J.D. Vance rushing to the microphones.
They wanted to take a victory lap.
Right. They were celebrating what they framed as a quick clinical victory.
And the Pentagon's initial metrics that they released to the press were wildly optimistic. They claimed to have successfully degraded 90% of Iran's short and medium-range missile capacity.
But the centerpiece of their victory narrative, the ultimate decapitation strike, as they called it, was the successful assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Which is a massive geopolitical event.
Right. So if you are writing a Hollywood script that is the climax of the movie, the weapons facilities are smoking craters, the primary antagonist is gone, roll the credits, cue the patriotic music, and everybody goes home.
But geopolitics doesn't have a neat 90-minute runtime.
Exactly. And this is where the paper introduces a brilliant concept. The author calls it the third law of geopolitical Newton.
For every hasty military action, there is an equal, opposite, and disproportionately expensive economic reaction.
That is the punchline. The quick win evaporated the moment the dust settled, because the strategic planners seemingly ignored the economic bedrock of their target.
They completely missed the big picture. Iran isn't just an isolated military adversary existing in a vacuum. It is, or was, deeply integrated into the world's most vital supply chains.
We're talking about oil, right?
Specifically, yes. Iran was China's single largest supplier of cheap, heavily sanctioned oil. We are talking about an estimated 1.38 million barrels of crude oil flowing to Beijing every single day.
And that's all moving through a shadow fleet of tankers.
Exactly.
Wait, I want to pause on that mechanism for a second. If the U.S. and Israel bomb the country supplying that oil, what does the Iranian leadership actually do? The assumption from Washington seemed to be that they would just surrender or maybe collapse into a civil war.
That was the neoconservative assumption, yes.
But they didn't. They essentially said, well, if our oil can't leave the region, nobody's oil leaves the region, and they immediately moved to block the Strait of Hormuz. Help me understand the mechanics of this blockade.
Yeah.
Are there literally Iranian destroyers lining up shoulder to shoulder to stop civilian tankers?
No, it's far more asymmetric than that, which honestly makes it infinitely harder to counter. The Strait of Hormuz is a massive geographic bottleneck. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are only about 2 miles wide in either direction.
That is incredibly narrow for those massive supertankers.
It really is. So Iran doesn't need to put a physical wall of warships across it. They just need to alter the risk calculus of global shipping conglomerates and maritime insurance companies.
So it's a financial blockade enforced by the threat of violence.
Exactly. Iran utilizes a combination of anti-ship cruise missiles hidden deep within the mountainous terrain of the Musandam Peninsula. Plus, they have swarms of heavily armed fast attack craft operated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
And mines. Right.
Yes. Most terrifyingly, for commercial shipping, they use smart sea mines. The moment a single oil tanker is struck or honestly even credibly threatened, the insurance syndicates like Lloyd's of London skyrocket their premiums for any vessel entering the Persian Gulf.
Because they don't want to pay out for a sunken supertanker.
Right. Very quickly, it becomes completely economically unviable for shipping companies to risk multi-million-dollar vessels and their crews. So the flow of roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply simply stops.
And the financial markets instantly called Washington's bluff. They didn't care about the press conferences or the destruction of missile silos. Oil was sitting at a relatively comfortable $60 a barrel in late February.
And then it exploded.
Literally. Within less than a week of Operation Epic Fury, the price spiked to $115 a barrel.
Which acts as a massive regressive tax on the entire global economy. I mean, central banks around the world have been sweating blood for years trying to control post-pandemic inflation.
They're just starting to get it under control.
Right. But suddenly the base cost of energy, which affects the price of everything from manufacturing plastics to delivering groceries to your local supermarket, gets an injection of military-grade steroids.
It's the ultimate asymmetric reality. The U.S. and Israel used billion-dollar stealth technology to achieve a tactical kinetic win. But Iran used basic geography and global market panic to inflict massive strategic economic pain.
And the idea that decapitating the leadership would cause the regime to crumble, that failed entirely.
Yeah. Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the assassinated leader, seamlessly stepped into his father's role.
The underlying bureaucracy of the theocracy just kept functioning.
It's incredible.
It really is. The assumption that removing the figurehead would collapse the entire system is a recurring fatal flaw in modern Western military planning. It treats foreign governments like a snake where you can just cut off the head.
Instead of what they actually are.
Right. They are highly resilient, deeply entrenched mycelial networks.
My analogy for this is it's like kicking down the door to a house, destroying all the expensive furniture in the living room, and taking out the patriarch. You feel like the toughest guy in the world for about 10 seconds.
Until you look around.
Right. Because then you realize you can't find the exit. Mm-hmm. The roof is literally on fire.
Yep.
And the neighbors have set up a toll booth charging you $100 just to use their fire hose.
That is a very painful but accurate visual.
And the asymmetric responses from Iran and its proxies get even more surreal. They didn't just threaten traditional military bases, did they?
No. The targeting matrix became highly unorthodox. Iran began issuing incredibly specific, almost corporate threats against U.S. retail bank branches across the Middle East.
Wait, they were threatening retail banks?
Yes. They were essentially threatening the ATMs and the branch managers. And then you have the regional proxy groups stepping in, like the Iraqi Islamic Resistance.
Right. The paper notes they claimed 27 attacks on U.S. interests in a single 24-hour window. But the detail here that perfectly captures the absolute absurdity of this new geopolitical era is the bounty they placed.
Oh, the bounty.
They put a public bounty on the heads of top U.S. military officials. And the price. 150 million Iraqi dinars. Which sounds like a terrifyingly huge number if you just read the headline.
Until you do the currency conversion.
Exactly. What does it convert to?
It converts to roughly 100,000 US dollars.
Which is humiliating. It is basically the annual salary of a mid-level IT manager in Ohio. You have a global superpower flying billion-dollar stealth bombers, and the adversary responds by putting a bounty on a U.S. general that wouldn't even buy a small condo in a major city.
It illustrates a total collapse of hegemonic deterrence. When an adversary puts a $100,000 bounty on your top military brass, they aren't afraid of you.
No, they are laughing at you.
Exactly. They aren't awed by your technological superiority. They're actively mocking you. They're signaling to their own domestic audience and to the broader region that the American empire is not a god to be feared, but a lumbering giant to be bled through 1,000 tiny cuts.
And while all this is happening, while the Middle East is burning and oil is at $115, the supposedly unified Western alliance is quietly shuffling toward the emergency exits.
They're checking their watches and backing away slowly.
We mentioned the U.S. relied heavily on the UK for bomber bases, but the analysis points out that European allies are reading the room, looking at the inflation numbers, and leaving the group chat. Spain, for instance.
Spain took a very hardline stance against the continuation of the war. By mid-March, they literally withdrew their ambassador to Tel Aviv.
And even in the UK, the political calculus was shifting rapidly. Prime Minister Keir Starmer was reportedly considering taking the new Octopus anti-drone system.
Which were originally earmarked for Ukraine.
Right, they were developed to defend Ukrainian infrastructure from Russia. And Starmer is looking at pivoting them down to the Middle East, not to win the war, but simply to protect British assets from the endless, exhausting reign of cheap, mass-produced Iranian Shahed drones.
It exposes a massive critical overextension of Western resources. You cannot arm Ukraine, defend European airspace, and simultaneously engage in a high-intensity conflict in the Persian Gulf without running out of interceptors. The math just doesn't work.
So if the PR promised this quick, clean win, but the reality is $115 oil fleeing allies and depleted missile stockpiles, how does a superpower sustain that narrative at home?
It doesn't, and that leads to a critical point in the analysis. When a superpower gets trapped in a burning house abroad, the smoke inevitably fills the hallways back home.
You can't hide it forever.
No. You cannot sustain a massively disruptive, wildly expensive foreign war without it causing a severe internal ideological fracture.
Which brings us to an event that is unfolding right now as we record this on March 17, 2026. The paper pivots from the military overextension abroad to the domestic political fallout in Washington. We are talking about the explosive, absolutely shocking resignation of Joe Kent.
The director of the National Counterterrorism Center, the NCTC.
Yes, and this is a seismic event within the Beltway. To truly grasp why this resignation is causing earthquakes, you have to look deeply into Joe Kent's profile. He is the furthest thing imaginable from a coastal liberal pacifist or a career academic.
Oh, absolutely. He is not a guy who goes to anti-war protests on the weekends.
Exactly. Joe Kent is a highly decorated former Green Beret. He served 11 combat tours in the most dangerous kinetic parts of the Middle East. He was a CIA intelligence officer.
And he has a very tragic personal connection to the region.
He does. Tragically, he lost his wife, Shannon Kent, who was a Navy cryptologist, to an ISIS suicide bomber in Syria. This is a man who understands the brutal flesh and blood reality of war and asymmetric terrorism on a deeply personal, visceral level.
Furthermore, his political pedigree is highly specific. He was handpicked by President Donald Trump. He represents the extreme right-wing, America First, libertarian-leaning faction of the conservative coalition.
Well, the faction that hates foreign intervention.
Yes. They are deeply skeptical of foreign entanglements and nation building. In fact, his confirmation as NCTC director in the Senate back in 2025 was a brutal partisan street fight.
I remember that. It was really close.
He only scraped by with a 52-44 vote, specifically because opposition Democrats accused him of having ties to extreme right-wing groups and espousing dangerous isolationist rhetoric.
I want to focus on his job title for a second, though. The director of the National Counterterrorism Center. This isn't some mid-level bureaucratic post.
No, he is at the absolute top of the intelligence pyramid.
His literal job description is to wake up every morning, read the absolute most highly classified sensitive intelligence from the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, and the military, and synthesize that data to find imminent terror threats against the United States. He is the guy who walks into the Oval Office and tells the president exactly where the danger is.
He is the ultimate clearinghouse for threat assessment.
Right. And today, the guy with that job took to X, formerly Twitter, and rage quit for the whole world to see.
He posted a resignation letter with immediate effect. And the core argument of that letter goes far beyond a simple disagreement over policy.
It wasn't just a polite, I'm stepping down to spend time with my family tweet.
Not at all. He stated, and I quote from his post, "I cannot in good conscience support the ongoing war in Iran." He explicitly claimed that based on his access to the intelligence, Iran posed no imminent threat to the American homeland.
Which just blows up the entire narrative.
Completely. And then he dropped the real political bombshell. He explicitly blamed the initiation of the war on the overwhelming pressure of Israel and its powerful American lobbying apparatus.
I mean, wow. Look, it's one thing for an opposition politician or an anti-war activist to stand up and say a war is unjustified. The White House communications team can easily write them off. They just label them as weak on defense or unpatriotic or highly partisan.
It's standard political theater.
But the incredible structural irony here is staggering. The guy whose literal Senate-confirmed job is to find imminent terror threats just quit on Twitter, telling the American public that the threat justifying a massive regional war is a total fiction.
It completely vaporizes the casus belli, the foundational justification for the war, right in front of the electorate. And it exposes a deep, irreconcilable ideological civil war within the Republican coalition.
I am trying to picture the chaos inside the West Wing right now. The press briefings must be an absolute nightmare.
The internal chaos is palpable. You have White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt scrambling to contain the fallout. She had to issue a blistering statement calling Kent's accusation that the president bowed to foreign lobbies absurd, insulting, and laughable.
But nobody in Washington is laughing, especially not when you look at who is noticeably not talking.
Ah, yes, the silence is very loud.
Joe Kent's direct superior in the intelligence hierarchy is the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. Now, her background is fascinating here. She is a veteran herself, and she became politically famous for her staunch anti-interventionist stance.
She literally used to sell no war with Iran merchandise during her past political campaigns.
Exactly. And right now, amidst her subordinate blowing the whistle on a war with Iran, total radio silence. She is saying absolutely nothing.
Her silence speaks volumes. It highlights this massive rift. On one side, you have the traditional hawkish neoconservative wing of the administration. People like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who view confronting Iran as an existential imperative and are pushing for continuous disproportionate military strikes.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have the America First isolationist wing, which Kent represents. They feel totally betrayed by a return to the exact kind of Middle Eastern regime change wars they built their political brand opposing.
Where does the vice president fit into this? Because J.D. Vance was one of the loudest voices celebrating the initial strikes back in February.
And that is where the political reality television aspect comes in. The analysis notes that Vice President Vance is reportedly caught dead in the middle of this rift.
How so?
Well, privately, he allegedly objects to the long-term viability and the massive economic cost of the war, aligning more with Kent's faction. But publicly, because he is tethered to the administration's stated policy, he is being forced to toe the line. He has to wear the hawk suit and project absolute confidence in a strategy he supposedly doubts.
So let's zoom out for a second. Is Joe Kent just one deeply traumatized, disgruntled employee who finally hit his breaking point after staring at classified documents for too long? Or does this resignation signify something much larger? Does it prove that the America First coalition is fundamentally cracking apart under the pressure of actual governance and foreign intervention?
The analysis strongly suggests the latter. It proves that the governing coalition is dangerously fractured at its core. When the veterans who actually know what an 11-tour logistical nightmare looks like, the people who have buried their spouses because of these conflicts, start abandoning ship and accusing the administration of fighting foreign wars for foreign lobbies, it signals a profound loss of domestic credibility.
It's a disaster for their messaging.
Washington is bleeding trust at home at the exact moment they are losing allies abroad.
And if we apply the stand-up comedy framework here, this is the moment the comedian realizes the front row is literally getting up and walking out. The hecklers are getting louder and the material just isn't landing anymore.
Exactly. And this dynamic creates a very dangerous, urgent psychological need for a declining superpower.
The need to win.
Right. When you feel isolated globally, when your economic leverage is failing, and when your own intelligence chiefs are quitting in protest, you desperately search for an audience that will still laugh at your jokes. You look for anyone who will take a smiling photo with you, validate your power, and offer unconditional loyalty.
Which brings us to South America. We are shifting our focus away from the burning oil fields of the Middle East and the chaotic briefing rooms of Washington and heading down to Argentina.
This is a fascinating pivot in the analysis.
It really is. It's framed around the relationship between the U.S. and Argentina's self-described anarcho-capitalist President Javier Milei. The author describes this relationship as a masterpiece of geopolitical cosplay.
Cosplay is the perfect term for it. In Argentina, the domestic joke, primarily lobbed by the political opposition, is that Milei is just a bad photocopy of Donald Trump. He is a local tribute act to the American original.
And on the surface, the aesthetic and rhetorical similarities are striking. They both share this highly performative theatrical disdain for traditional political institutions.
Trump built his brand on promising to drain the swamp of D.C. insiders.
And Milei campaigns wielding an actual literal chainsaw. He promises to destroy what he calls the caste of corrupt Argentine politicians.
They both utilize highly incendiary, aggressive rhetoric tailored specifically for social media algorithms, bypassing traditional media entirely. They both share a deep vocal skepticism of climate change, often framing environmentalism as a form of disguised cultural Marxism.
Right. If you just look at their Twitter feeds, they are a match made in heaven. They speak the exact same algorithmic language. But here is where the paper pulls back the curtain on the profound ideological dissonance between the two. Because the moment you move past the tweets and look at their actual economic philosophies, they are complete opposites. It is almost absurd.
The contradiction is glaring. Donald Trump is the undisputed modern king of protectionism. His entire economic philosophy is based on using massive punitive tariffs as a geopolitical weapon to protect domestic manufacturing.
He loves tariffs.
He runs up massive federal deficits to subsidize American industry and believes in a highly interventionist state when it comes to trade.
Well, Javier Milei is a free market fundamentalist. He believes any state intervention in trade, any tariff, any subsidy is a moral aberration.
He's cutting everything.
He is currently executing a brutal, bone-deep fiscal adjustment in Argentina, freezing public works, slashing government ministries, and attempting to unilaterally eliminate tariffs to expose the economy to global competition.
The irony of this relationship really peaked when prominent American libertarian think tanks institutions that theoretically align with Milei had to publish op-eds literally begging Donald Trump to learn from President Milei about the virtues of free trade and balanced budgets.
While Trump is doing the exact opposite.
Right, while Trump was busy in the Oval Office slapping tariffs on everything that crossed an ocean.
Yet despite these massive foundational economic contradictions, the political romance between Washington and Buenos Aires is blooming like spring. Milei has essentially become a permanent VIP fixture at Mar-a-Lago.
He is always there.
He has traveled to the U.S. over a dozen times in his first 2 years in office, and he often prioritizes tech conferences and conservative galas over traditional state visits. And this absolute obsequiousness paid off in a massive way in late 2025.
Let's contextualize that payoff because it's huge. In late 2025, Argentina was facing a brutal, deepening recession, the looming threat of a massive currency run and crucial midterm elections that could have broken Milei's entire legislative agenda.
So what does the Trump administration do?
They maneuvered to hand Milei a staggering $20 billion credit line. It was a massive financial bailout designed explicitly to save his biggest ideological fan.
And following that massive infusion of cash in March 2026, the two nations signed a very broad, somewhat vague free trade agreement. But I'm stuck on the math here. The paper cites analysts at the Stimson Center who point out that this deal makes absolutely zero economic sense for Argentina.
To understand why, you have to look at Argentina's economic history.
Right. Break that down for me.
Argentina is not a hyper-competitive, export-driven manufacturing powerhouse. For decades, stretching back to the Peronist era, their manufacturing and industrial sectors have been heavily protected by the state.
Import substitution, right?
Exactly. Import substitution industrialization, building high tariff walls so local industries could survive without having to compete globally. As a result, much of their domestic industry is highly inefficient, technologically outdated, and utterly reliant on state protection to survive.
And the paper uses this fantastic sports analogy to explain the danger of this new free trade agreement. Opening up Argentina's fragile, unprotected industry to heavily subsidized, highly efficient, technologically advanced U.S. goods overnight is like taking a malnourished neighborhood soccer team that doesn't even own matching cleats and putting them on the pitch against the starting lineup of Real Madrid.
It's not competition.
No, it's an economic slaughter waiting to happen. Local factories will simply be wiped out. So I have to ask, if Argentina has almost nothing to offer the U.S. economically that justifies a $20 billion bailout, and if the trade deal is going to crush Argentine industry, why are they doing this?
Because it's not about economics. It is purely 100% geopolitical. It's what the analysis sarcastically dubs the Don Roe Doctrine.
Like a play on the Monroe Doctrine.
Right, a modern, highly egocentric spin on the historical Monroe Doctrine. The $20 billion wasn't an investment in the Argentine economy. It was the purchase price for a loyal, ideological beachhead in the Southern Hemisphere.
What are they trying to achieve with that beachhead?
Washington is actively trying to buy a proxy to block the growing commercial influence of China in Latin America, and to act as a counterweight to the political influence of Brazil under Lula da Silva. Trump is essentially subsidizing a loyal satellite state that will vote with the U.S. at the UN and parrot American talking points globally.
And Milei seems perfectly happy to play that role. In fact, he is so consumed by his self-appointed position as the ultimate defender of Western values that his behavior becomes deeply surreal. The paper highlights this incredible contrast. While the Middle East is literally burning, oil is at $115 and the global economy is shaking, the president of Argentina is in New York giving speeches and simultaneously getting into massive, petty Twitter fights with local podcasters back home.
The Tomás Ribord incident. It is a perfect micro-case study that encapsulates the bizarre, deeply warped priorities of the Milei administration.
Tell me if I have the details of this right, because it sounds like a fever dream. Tomás Ribord is a very popular, somewhat provocative Argentine streamer and podcaster. He criticized President Milei on a show because Milei had this highly emotional crying breakdown while visiting the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem.
Yes, that's how it started.
Ribord basically made a flippant comment saying something like, "Look, I respect theology, but how many times can a grown man cry over a stone wall?" It was a mildly offensive, totally trivial piece of internet commentary.
In any normal era, a head of state wouldn't even know a streamer made that comment, let alone react to it.
But this spirals completely out of control. The comment results in a formal criminal complaint filed by the DAIA, which is the delegation of Israeli associations in Argentina. They formally accuse this streamer of anti-Semitism. And instead of acting like a president dealing with 200% inflation and staying out of domestic internet drama, Javier Milei takes to Twitter.
He couldn't resist.
He quote tweets the news of the lawsuit in all caps, calling the legal harassment of a podcaster a masterclass.
It perfectly illustrates a government that possesses an infinite capacity to generate cultural noise on social media while simultaneously artificially importing the heavy, complex ancestral conflicts of the Middle East directly into domestic Argentine internet drama. It is performative geopolitics at its most absurd.
But the analysis makes a chilling pivot here. Because being the ultimate fanboy of an empire is all fun and games when it just involves retweeting each other, taking photos at Mar-a-Lago, and fighting with podcasters. But eventually, the empire you are so desperate to impress is going to ask for a return on its $20 billion investment.
And those favors involve real commitments and real weapons.
This is where the dark comedy of the paper shifts into a tragedy of logistics. It contrasts Argentina's sweeping, hyper-militaristic defender of the West rhetoric with the grim, rusted reality of its actual physical capabilities.
The description of the Argentine military in this paper is brutal. The author says Argentina's true projection of military power is equivalent to a pair of rusted kayaks and a deflated yellow rubber duck.
Which, tragically, is not much of an exaggeration, is it?
No, it's really not. Following the end of the military dictatorship in 1983 and exacerbated by endless cyclical economic crises, the Argentine armed forces have been systematically defunded and hollowed out for 40 years.
They just don't have the gear.
Their naval ships rarely sail because they lack fuel and maintenance. Their Air Force practically lost its supersonic intercept capability years ago.
But President Milei, absolutely desperate to project power and please his allies in Washington, decides to go on a highly publicized military shopping spree. The crown jewel of this effort, the purchase of 24 second-hand F-16 fighter jets from Denmark.
For roughly $300 million, which was heavily subsidized by a relatively meager $40 million grant from the U.S. Foreign Military Financing Program. The U.S. facilitated the deal primarily to ensure Argentina didn't buy cheaper jets from China.
And the public relations rollout for this acquisition was extraordinary.
Oh, the photo op was legendary. In December 2025, the first 6 of these used Danish jets arrive in Cordoba. And President Milei doesn't just hold a press conference, he puts on a literal leather bomber jacket. He is fully cosplaying as Tom Cruise in Top Gun.
He loves a good costume.
He really does. He poses on the tarmac with his sister and the defense minister in front of the jets, giving a grand sweeping speech. He calls these 40-year-old planes the guardian angels of Argentine airspace and declares that a nation cannot have true sovereignty without overwhelming military capacity.
But the logistical reality check that the paper provides regarding these F-16s is devastating. The administration treated the purchase like buying a fleet of used cars. But a modern fighter jet is not a standalone vehicle. It is the center of a massively expensive, incredibly complex logistical ecosystem.
The initial $300 million is just the down payment. The true long-term cost of this acquisition is projected to balloon to over $1.5 billion.
How does the price tag jump that high?
Because the jets themselves are essentially empty shells without the weapon systems. Argentina has to purchase the U.S. weaponry separately. They have to pay for critical electronic warfare upgrades provided by a Danish company called Terma just to keep the planes relevant in a modern threat environment.
So they are buying planes that need immediate upgrades.
Exactly. They have to build specialized hangars, purchase highly specific aviation fuel, and constantly buy replacement parts. Furthermore, tethering your Air Force to a NATO standard maintenance system means you are paying top-tier first-world prices for every single bolt and diagnostic test.
In a country that is actively freezing public works projects and struggling with basic inflation, the operational details detailed in the analysis are staggering. Argentina doesn't even possess the specialized mid-air refueling tankers like the KC-135s necessary to actually fly these F-16s across the ocean for a real international deployment.
They're essentially landlocked.
And the day-to-day operating cost.
Yeah.
The paper notes that the cost to fly just one of these F-16s for a single hour of training is equivalent to the entire annual bandage and gauze budget of a regional public hospital.
It is the pure illusion of power. It's a vanity project. From a purely economic standpoint, they had cheaper alternatives. They turned down an offer for Chinese JF-17s, which came with vastly superior financing terms and fewer operational restrictions purely out of fear of offending Donald Trump and jeopardizing that $20 billion lifeline.
My analogy for this entire situation is it's like a guy who is flat broke but desperate to impress his rich neighbors. So he takes out a massive loan he can't afford and buys a used Formula One race car. He parks it in his driveway, puts on a racing suit, and takes selfies with it all day.
But he has no idea how to drive it.
Right. He can't afford the special high-octane gas. He doesn't have a pit crew to change the tires. And he literally doesn't own a trailer to take the car to an actual track. It's an incredibly expensive, highly lethal lawn ornament.
A very apt metaphor. But the theatrics don't stop with simply buying planes they can't afford to fly. The paper details an upcoming event that pushes the cosplay into dangerous territory. Operation Atlantic Dagger, scheduled for April 6, 2026.
This read like the synopsis of a Michael Bay invasion movie. This isn't just a handful of officers doing a map exercise. The paper describes this as the most complex, massive special forces joint exercise in South American history.
Yes, you have a projected deployment of roughly 400 elite U.S. personnel. We are talking about Army Green Berets, MARSOC Marines, and Air Force Special Operations teams. They are setting up a massive operational footprint in the peaceful valleys of Cordoba, Argentina.
Which is so jarring. Cordoba is a place where the locals are famous for their universities, relaxing in the hills, drinking Fernet, and listening to cuarteto music. And suddenly, the U.S. military is rolling in. And they aren't just bringing troops. The paper highlights the inclusion of an AC-130J Ghost Rider gunship.
The Ghost Rider is a massive, heavily armed flying fortress. It is specifically designed to loiter over a target and rain-sustain devastating artillery fire on insurgents. It is a weapon of asymmetric counterinsurgency heavily utilized in places like Afghanistan. The idea of flying it over the hills of central Argentina is strategically bizarre.
I have to push back a little here, though. Isn't this just standard military modernization? Countries hold joint training exercises all the time to improve interoperability. Why does the paper frame this as such a sinister development?
Because of the geopolitical context and the scale. Critics, both within Argentina and across the region, argue this isn't just a training drill. It is essentially the formalization of a U.S. security enclave in the heart of the Southern Cone.
So it's about projecting power regionally.
Yes. It is designed to allow the U.S. to project rapid military power towards the South Atlantic, monitor the strategic choke points near Antarctica, and send a highly visible, heavily armed warning to China regarding its investments in the region.
But the analysis identifies a massive looming trap for President Milei in all of this posturing. Let's connect the dots back to the Middle East. What happens when Donald Trump, who we established, is bogged down in a failing war in Iran, dealing with $115 oil, losing European allies, and facing mutiny from his own intelligence chiefs like Joe Kent, wakes up at 3 a.m. furious and calls his biggest fan, Javier Milei, asking for actual kinetic military support in the Persian Gulf?
That is the moment the stand-up routine crashes into a brick wall. Milei has completely cornered himself with his own hyper-aligned rhetoric. If Trump demands a coalition force to share the burden in Iran, Milei faces an impossible choice.
What happens if he says no?
If he says no, if he refuses to send Argentine troops or assets, he instantly breaks the spell of the relationship. He loses the $20 billion financial lifeline his economy depends on, and he likely faces the devastating, vindictive wrath of Trump's tariffs.
But if he says yes?
If he says yes, he has to actually figure out how to project his deflated rubber duck military halfway across the globe to a hyper-modern, deeply isometric war zone in the Middle East. He can't send the F-16s. They can't get there.
They literally can't cross the ocean.
Right. He would have to send a token force, maybe some medics, a logistical team, or an obsolete naval patrol boat. The result would be total logistical humiliation on the world stage, exposing the absolute hollowness of his military posturing. It's a lose-lose scenario born entirely of blind, uncalculated subservience to a distracted superpower.
And as the expert analysis points out, Washington knows this. The Pentagon knows perfectly well that a handful of Argentine medics or a broken-down destroyer isn't going to turn the tide against Iranian sea mines in the Strait of Hormuz.
They know it's purely symbolic.
Exactly. So frustrated by his strategic failures in the Middle East and plagued by high-profile domestic resignations, the president looks for a distraction. He needs a win. A cheap, easy, highly televised victory in his own backyard against a target that literally cannot defend itself.
Which brings us to our final and perhaps darkest theater of this global deep dive. We are shifting focus to the Caribbean, specifically the island of Cuba.
The paper illustrates how the U.S. administration, desperate to project strength, is applying the aggressive, ruthless, and entirely transactional logic of a Wall Street corporate merger to a desperate, starving sovereign nation.
The timeline of this tragedy, as laid out in the paper, is breathtaking in its speed and cruelty. Let's walk the listener through the mechanics of how you turn off an entire country.
It starts in January 2026. The U.S. intelligence apparatus successfully captures the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro. Now, setting aside the complex politics of Venezuela, what is the immediate practical impact of that capture on Cuba?
Survival. Cuba's heavily centralized, incredibly fragile economy is entirely dependent on imported energy. For years, the Maduro regime in Venezuela had been supplying Cuba with massive shipments of heavily subsidized heavy crude oil.
It was the lifeblood of the grid.
It was the only thing keeping the lights on. The moment Maduro is removed from power, that geopolitical arrangement shatters. The subsidized oil stops flowing immediately. Cuba's minimal national reserves start drying up within days.
And Washington senses the vulnerability instantly. On January 29, 2026, President Trump implements a draconian global naval and energy blockade against Cuba. Now, I want to clarify how this works. Is the U.S. Navy literally forming a ring of destroyers around the island and firing warning shots at oil tankers?
It rarely requires kinetic action. A modern blockade relies on the weaponization of the U.S. financial system through secondary sanctions. The U.S. Treasury Department essentially decrees that any shipping company, any insurance syndicate, or any nation that dares to deliver a single drop of fuel to Cuba will be entirely locked out of the U.S. banking system and face massive tariffs.
So it's economic warfare.
Purely economic. For a global shipping conglomerate, the math is simple. You do not risk losing access to the American market just to deliver a tanker of diesel to Havana. The deterrence is financial, but the result is a physical, surgical strangulation of the island's energy supply.
And it works with devastating efficiency. We jump forward to March 16, 2026. The paper details the collapse. The Antonio Guterres power plant, which is the massive Soviet-era thermoelectric plant that serves as the backbone of the Cuban national grid, completely collapses. Not from a mechanical failure, but because it literally ran out of fuel to burn.
And when a primary node like Antonio Guterres goes offline unexpectedly, it creates a massive instability in the grid's electrical frequency. The other smaller plants can't handle the sudden load demand, leading to cascading failures across the entire substation network.
So the whole thing just trips.
The grid protects itself by shutting down completely. 11 million people are plunged into a total apocalyptic blackout. And the analysis notes this isn't an isolated incident. It's the third total national blackout in just 4 months.
The description of the ground reality is horrifying. Without power, the entire fabric of modern society unravels in hours. Food is rotting in warm refrigerators across the country. Hospitals running out of diesel for their backup generators are forced to halt tens of thousands of critical surgeries. The municipal water pumps stop working, meaning millions of people have no access to clean drinking water.
It's a complete systemic collapse.
Mountains of garbage are piling up in the sweltering streets of Havana because there is no fuel for the sanitation trucks. It is a man-made humanitarian catastrophe.
It pushes the nation to the absolute brink of total societal collapse. And amidst this immense, very real human suffering, the bureaucratic absurdity of the geopolitical stand-up routine shines through. The U.S. Embassy in Havana, operating out of their fortified compound, actually tweeted out an official advisory to American citizens remaining on the island.
The tweet advised them to conserve fuel, water, and food.
Which is the most darkly comedic, tone-deaf thing imaginable.
They're officially advising people to conserve the very basic necessities of life that have vanished entirely because of the embassy's own government policy. It's like breaking into someone's house, stealing their oxygen tank, and then leaving a helpful sticky note on the wall advising them to take shallow breaths.
The irony is staggering. But the strategy achieves its immediate goal. The crushing pressure forces the Cuban government under President Miguel Diaz-Canel to their knees. Desperate to get the U.S. to the negotiating table just to allow a few fuel shipments through Cuba, is forced to preemptively release 51 political prisoners.
Just to get a meeting.
It is treated as a down payment just for the privilege of begging for energy relief.
But the analysis reveals that Washington doesn't want a traditional diplomatic win.
Yeah.
They don't want concessions or policy changes. In late February, Trump starts altering his rhetoric. He stops talking about Cuba as a sovereign nation with a hostile government and begins talking about it as a distressed asset.
Like a real estate deal.
He floats the phrase friendly takeover.
Yeah.
Like he's a corporate raider looking at a bankrupt casino in Atlantic City that he wants to buy for pennies on the dollar.
And he escalates this corporate raiding rhetoric dramatically on March 16th, the exact day the Cuban power grid fully collapses. In a highly publicized press conference, Trump tells reporters that he will have the immense honor of taking Cuba. He states that he will either liberate it through a deal or simply take it by force.
He literally looks into the cameras and says the end of Cuba is here.
Which is an insane escalation.
You can't just say that. A sitting U.S. president openly threatening to annex a sovereign Caribbean nation causes absolute panic. Global financial markets already rattled by the war in Iran, and $115 oil completely freak out at the prospect of an unprovoked U.S. invasion in its own hemisphere.
The uncertainty just shatters the markets.
The price of gold skyrockets to $50-$30 an ounce as terrified investors sprint away from the dollar and towards safe haven assets. It is absolute madness.
The paper absolutely nails the underlying psychology of this moment. It is the ultimate paradox of a declining, overextended empire. The U.S. military apparatus is currently spending billions of dollars to fail against a real, hardened strategic adversary in Iran. They are effectively losing the asymmetric economic war in the Middle East.
So they punch down.
Exactly. To compensate for that humiliation, to project an aura of strength to the domestic voter base, the administration acts like a schoolyard bully. They try to buy a crippled, blacked-out, starving island in the Caribbean at a steep discount purely for the domestic public relations win. It's a calculated distraction technique aimed squarely at hawkish voters in key swing states like Florida.
It completely blows my mind. My analogy for this scenario is this. It's like a predatory, ruthless landlord who secretly sneaks down to the basement and cuts the power to an apartment building in the middle of a freezing winter. And then a week later, he knocks on the front door wearing a nice suit, offering to buy the whole building from the freezing tenants at a 90% discount because they can't pay the light bill.
That's exactly what it is.
I have to ask you, as someone who studies these trends, is this friendly takeover concept actual codified military doctrine now? Is this how foreign policy is conducted? Or is this just a cheap fireworks show designed to distract the American public from the body bags and depleted treasuries resulting from Operation Epic Fury?
It is entirely a cheap fireworks show, but a highly destructive one. The analysis concludes that this is the defining characteristic of geopolitics in 2026. The grand, methodical strategies of the 20th century, the careful chess match we talked about at the beginning, have been entirely replaced by impulsive, opportunistic reality TV tactics.
It's all about the performance.
It's all about securing the immediate headline, driving algorithmic engagement on social media, and continually distracting the audience from the massive structural failures happening off stage.
So let's pull all of these threads together and connect this massive global picture right back to you, the listener. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today. We started in the burning, oil-slicked waters of the Middle East, flew down to a bizarre military cosplay exercise in the peaceful hills of Argentina, and ended in the pitch-black, desperate streets of Havana.
It's a very grim picture.
The overarching point of this brilliant analysis is clear. 2026 is the year traditional diplomacy officially died. It has been replaced by stand-up comedy geopolitics, where leaders are just sweating under the spotlight, improvising punchlines with billion-dollar weapons, and hoping the crowd doesn't notice the theater is on fire.
And the most crucial takeaway from this entire framework is that while this might look like abstract political theater or a distant reality show playing out on your phone, the consequences are incredibly tangible and deeply real.
Exactly. You might be driving to work right now thinking, why on earth should I care if Argentina buys used Danish fighter jets they can't afford? Or why should it matter to me if a guy named Joe Kent tweets a resignation letter in Washington?
You should care because you are the one sitting in the audience.
And you are the one paying the 2-drink minimum at this chaotic comedy club. Whether it's paying the downstream costs of $115 oil every time you fill up your gas tank, dealing with runaway sticky inflation every time you go to the grocery store, or watching your retirement savings lose real value as panicked investors drive gold past $5,000 an ounce. The audience is ultimately paying the bill for every single one of these geopolitical punchlines.
If I can leave the listener with one final provocative thought to mull over as they process all of this, it's this. We've spent the last hour dissecting exactly how the reigning global superpower is currently operating. We see an empire that treats its hardened strategic enemies like hostile corporate acquisitions and treats its most enthusiastic, desperate allies like mere props for photo ops. If that is the new accepted standard of global leadership, what happens when the rest of the world simply decides the joke isn't funny anymore? What happens when the global majority, the nations of the global south, the emerging economies, quietly decide to get up, walk out of the comedy club entirely, and start building a completely separate parallel global system that unplugs from Washington's financial and military dominance once and for all?
It's a terrifying thought, because when the lights finally come up in the club and the audience is left, the mess left behind on that stage is going to be monumental. That is definitely something to think about the next time you turn on the evening news and see a politician trying out a new tight five. Thank you for diving deep with us today.